Remember, I'm a Navy SEAL. He seized her arm with both hands, yanked her out of her chair, and slammed her against the table hard enough to rattle every tray within 10 feet. 1,040 soldiers froze. Not one of them moved. Not one of them breathed. Because Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, decorated untouchable legendary, had just put his hands on a woman who had not flinched once. Not even now. Not even with his face 2 inches from hers. He had no idea what he had just started. 4 seconds later, he was on the floor. Before we go any further, if stories about real justice, real courage, and the truth that no rank can protect you from your own arrogance speak to you, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this story all the way to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. There is a particular kind of man who walks into a room and expects the air itself to change. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had been that man for so long, he no longer thought about it. It was simply the natural order of things, the way gravity pulls water downhill, the way night follows day. He walked in and people noticed. He spoke and people listened. He stood still and the space around him rearranged itself out of respect or fear or some complicated mixture of both that most people couldn't name, but every single one of them felt. They called him Tank. Not because someone assigned it to him, because he earned it the way a man earns a scar, through pain, through pressure, through moments that would have broken someone smaller. 6'3", 220 pounds of muscle and memory and hard-won discipline. He had 3 combat tours in Afghanistan behind him, 2 silver stars on his record, and a handshake from a general who told him on a cold morning in Kandahar that men like him were the reason the mission succeeded. He kept that memory close, closer than most people knew. At 38 years old, Tank Rodriguez was everything the United States Navy said a warrior should be. His record was clean on paper. His reputation was enormous in the hallways. And his confidence, that deep, unshakable certainty that he was the most capable man in any room he entered, had been reinforced so many times by so many people that it had long since stopped feeling like pride and started feeling like fact. That was the problem with facts you've never tested. Sometimes they're not facts at all. The mess hall at Camp Lejeune on a Thursday morning was not a quiet place. Over 1,000 personnel moved through it during the breakfast rush, soldiers and sailors and support staff, and officers of every rank. The controlled chaos of a military base doing what military bases do, functioning relentlessly at scale. The noise was constant, the clatter of trays, the low rumble of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from a corner table, the efficient, mechanical rhythm of people who ate not for pleasure but for fuel. Tank moved through it the way he moved through everything, with authority, with presence, with the particular ease of a man who has never once had to wonder whether he belongs somewhere. People stepped aside without being asked. A junior enlisted soldier practically jumped out of his path. 2 officers nodded as he passed, not the formal nod of rank recognition, but something more instinctive, more primal. The acknowledgement of a predator moving through familiar territory. He was halfway to the coffee station when he saw her, or rather when he noticed that she hadn't noticed him. She was sitting alone at the end of a long table near the east wall. Mid-20s, he guessed Asian American, athletic, without advertising it. She was in civilian clothes, which was itself unusual enough to register. Plain dark jacket, dark pants, nothing that announced rank or unit or affiliation. She had a cup of coffee in front of her and a small notebook beside it, and she was writing something with the focused, unhurried concentration of a person who had nowhere else to be and no interest in anything that wasn't directly in front of her. She didn't look up when he walked past. That alone would have been unremarkable. People didn't always look up. But Tank had passed within 4 feet of her, and something about the completeness of her indifference, the absolute undramatic absence of any reaction to his presence, registered in the back of his mind like a wrong note in a song you've heard 1,000 times. He got his coffee. He told himself it didn't matter. He lasted about 90 seconds before he looked back at her. She was still writing, still unhurried, still entirely perfectly unconcerned with anything happening around her. A young corporal 2 seats down from her was watching Tank with obvious attention, practically vibrating with the awareness of proximity to someone legendary. The woman didn't even blink. Tank's jaw tightened in a way he wouldn't have admitted to anyone. He told himself again that it didn't matter. He was Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, decorated SEAL, 15 years of service, 2 silver stars. He did not need the acknowledgement of a woman in civilian clothes at a Thursday morning breakfast table at Camp Lejeune. He had bigger things to think about. He had a briefing at 0900 and a physical evaluation at 1100 and approximately 0 reasons to spend another second thinking about someone who hadn't looked at him. He walked toward her anyway. He told himself he was just being social. "You're at the wrong table," he said. It wasn't true. There was no assigned seating. He knew that. She knew that. Everyone within earshot knew that. But it was the kind of statement that required a response, an apology, a confusion, a moment of deference, and that was what he was actually after. Not the table, the response. She looked up. Her eyes were calm, not nervous, not impressed, not the particular combination of flattered and intimidated that Tank had grown accustomed to seeing in the eyes of people he addressed without warning. She just looked at him with the steady measuring gaze of someone assessing a situation rather than reacting to it. "I don't think so," she said. Her voice was even, conversational, as though he'd said something mildly interesting rather than something designed to put her off balance. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited. Around them, the ambient noise of the mess hall shifted slightly, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way that group attention shifts when something charged enters the space. Heads turned, conversations dropped half a register. The corporal 2 seats down suddenly found something very important to look at on the ceiling. "You on base for something?" Tank asked, letting his size occupy the space. Leaning slightly forward, taking up the table, the posture of a man who had learned that physical presence was its own language and spoke it fluently. "Yes," she said. She had gone back to writing. He stared at her. "You're going to want to give me a little more than that." She finished whatever she was writing, capped her pen, and set it down with a precision that seemed almost deliberate, the small, controlled gesture of someone who does not rush under pressure. Then she looked at him again. "I'm not sure why," she said. The corporal made a sound that might have been a cough, or might have been something else entirely. Tank felt something hot move through his chest, not quite anger yet, but the thing that precedes it, the thing that shows up when the world fails to behave the way it's supposed to. He was used to that feeling in combat. He was significantly less comfortable with it in a mess hall over scrambled eggs. "I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez," he said, and there was a particular weight in the way he said it, the deliberate weight of a name that was supposed to carry meaning. "Navy SEAL, 15 years of service. I've done 3 tours in—" "I heard you the first time," she said. "Congratulations on your service." The politeness of it was somehow worse than dismissal. It was the tone of someone completing an obligation briefly, cleanly, and without any of the warmth the obligation usually implied. Tank's eyes narrowed. "You didn't let me finish." "I didn't need to. You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to," she said, and something in her voice shifted. Then not louder, not harder, but more precise, the way a lens sharpens when you adjust the focus. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, SEAL Team 6 currently assigned to Camp Lejeune. Your record is impressive. Your presence at this table is not." The mess hall had gone noticeably quieter. Not silent, there were still hundreds of people moving and eating and talking, but the silence around their corner had grown and expanded the way silence does when something is happening that everyone wants to witness, but no one wants to be caught watching. Tank sat back, not retreating. He would never have framed it as retreating, but recalibrating. The woman across from him had just demonstrated that she knew more about him than he knew about her, and that asymmetry of information was something his training recognized as tactically significant, even if the part of his brain currently running this conversation refused to act on it. "Okay," he said, "then who are you?" She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. The kind of pause that, in retrospect, people would describe as the pause before everything changed. "Someone with a higher clearance than yours," she said. It would be recorded later in multiple witness statements as the moment the mess hall truly went quiet. Because here was the thing about Camp Lejeune. At 0730 on a Thursday morning, there were veterans there, people who had been in the service for decades, who had seen decorated officers dressing down, enlisted men, who had seen confrontations over rank and territory, and pride that escalated into something career-ending. They knew the sounds of military conflict, not the kind with weapons, but the kind with egos, which was its own form of combat with its own particular casualty patterns. They knew when the something real was happening, and what was happening at the east wall table between the 220-pound decorated SEAL and the young woman in civilian clothes who had not yet looked away from him with anything resembling concern was something real. Higher clearance, Tank repeated. The words came out slow, the way words do when someone is deciding what they mean. You heard me. You're going to tell me your name. I don't think I am. I'm making a request. You sat down at my table uninvited and told me I was in the wrong seat, she said. That wasn't a request. That was the beginning of something you are now trying to reframe as conversation. I'm not interested in participating in either version. A sergeant first class named Dominguez, sitting 3 tables away with 2 of his team members, would later tell investigators that he almost stood up right then, not to intervene, but because he was so unused to witnessing someone speak to Tank Rodriguez that way, with that particular combination of precision and calm, that his body had responded as though something seismic were occurring. He wasn't wrong. Tank leaned forward again. This time the lean was slower, more deliberate, and the warmth had gone out of his face, replaced by something older and harder. The expression of a man who has decided he is no longer interested in being reasonable. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to tell me your name, your unit, and why you're sitting in my mess hall like you belong here. Because right now you don't look like anything I need to take seriously, and I'm going to need you to change my mind. She picked up her coffee. She took a sip. She set it down. Sergeant Rodriguez, she said, and the use of his rank without the preceding title, without the deference, without the faint note of respect that he was accustomed to hearing, even from people who didn't like him. I have been sitting here since 0645, writing up notes on an active investigation, not bothering anyone. You came to this table, you have been the aggressor in every exchange that has followed, and I want to be very clear with you. I am giving you one opportunity to stand up and walk away, and after that opportunity passes, the situation becomes considerably more complicated for you than it already is. Someone across the mess hall dropped a tray. In the silence that had gathered around that east wall table, it sounded like a gunshot. Tank stared at her. She held his gaze without blinking. Around them, the mess hall breathed hundreds of people, most of them no longer pretending to have conversations, all of them watching, all of them processing the extraordinary thing happening 12 feet from where they were sitting, a decorated Navy SEAL, a man with a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered, being told clearly, calmly, without hesitation to leave. By a woman who hadn't told him her name. He should have left. Every instinct that his training had built, the tactical instincts, the threat assessment, the ability to read a situation and recognize when the ground beneath you has shifted. Every one of those instincts was telling him the same thing in the same clear, unambiguous language that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours in one of the most dangerous theaters in the world. Leave the table. Walk away. This is not a fight you can win. And he almost did. There was a moment, a single unclaimed moment, when he started to push his chair back, when the part of him that had survived 15 years of hard combat nearly overruled the part of him that had been sitting in peacetime long enough to forget why surviving mattered. But then he saw Private Delacroix, 19 years old, fresh out of basic, a kid from Louisiana who had been assigned to Tank's unit 3 weeks earlier, and who looked at the staff sergeant with the particular wide-eyed reverence of a young man who has recently discovered what the word hero means and applied it uncritically to the nearest available example. Delacroix was sitting 2 tables away watching, and the expression on his face, the waiting, the watching, the unspoken expectation that the man he'd spent 3 weeks idolizing was about to reassert the natural order of things, was the thing that made Tank stay. Because Tank Rodriguez, for all his genuine capability, for all his real and documented courage, in genuinely dangerous places had a weakness that 15 years of commendations had never required him to examine. He needed to be seen winning. You know what he said, and his voice had dropped, gotten quieter and more dangerous in the way that voices do when they've moved past performance and into something personal. I don't know who you think you are, but I've been in this uniform since before you graduated high school, and I have never not once backed down from a direct challenge, and I'm not starting today. This wasn't a challenge, she said. It was a courtesy. I don't need your courtesy. No, she said. You needed my warning. Those are different things. He stood up, the full height of him, 6 feet 3 inches, of decorated SEAL standing over the table in a mess hall that now had the complete undivided attention of over 1,000 people. He was not a man who used his size as a weapon. In civilian spaces, he would have said that about himself, genuinely believed it. But he was also not a man who was accustomed to standing in front of a woman who looked at him the way this woman was looking at him levelly, without moving back, without the flinch that physical size usually produced. "Last chance," he said. "Last chance for what?" she asked. "To tell me who you are." "I told you," she said. "Someone with a higher clearance than yours." He reached for her arm. Later, there would be many different accounts of what happened in the next 4 seconds. Some people would describe it in slow motion with the granular precision of a combat debrief. Others would say it happened so fast they almost missed it, that one moment the staff sergeant's hand was moving toward the woman's arm, and the next moment he was on the floor. The details varied. The outcome did not. His hand closed around her forearm. Her response was immediate, controlled, and devastating in its efficiency. The palm strike came first, not a blow driven by anger, but by physics. The clean transfer of force delivered to a specific point with the precision of someone who had practiced this motion until it was no longer thought, but reflex. His grip loosened, his balance shifted. She had already moved. The low sweep was almost graceful. The technical, efficient grace of a movement that had been trained into the body so deeply it had become instinct, her leg taking his feet out from under him before he had fully processed losing his grip. He went down. 220 pounds of decorated seal in front of 1,040 people hit the floor of the Camp Lejeune mess hall with a sound that would be described in at least 14 separate witness statements as the loudest thing many of them had ever heard in a room without weapons. He tried to get up. She placed her boot precisely without malice, with the controlled application of exactly enough force against his solar plexus. He stopped trying. The mess hall was so silent that someone in the back near the service counter could be heard setting down a coffee mug. She looked down at him. "My name is Sarah Chen," she said. Her voice had not changed at all. Still precise, still carrying the same quality of a person who is neither surprised nor excited by what has just occurred. "I am a special investigator with the Defense Intelligence Agency. You just assaulted a federal agent, and that is going to create paperwork for a significant number of people, including you." She stepped back. She picked up her notebook from the table. She capped her pen. Around her, over 1,000 people stood or sat in the kind of absolute silence that only arrives when something has happened that language isn't quite fast enough to catch up to, when reality has moved ahead of the words available to describe it, and everyone present is processing simultaneously the fact that what they just witnessed was real. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, Navy SEAL, 15 years of service, 2 Silver Stars, 3 tours in Afghanistan. A handshake from a general in Kandahar who told him men like him were the reason the mission succeeded, lay on the floor of the mess hall at Camp Lejeune and stared at the ceiling. And Private Delacroix, 19 years old, fresh out of basic from Louisiana, sat 2 tables away with his mouth open and said absolutely nothing at all. Because sometimes the stories we tell about people, the legends we build, the pedestals, we construct the stories we use to explain why certain people deserve the space they take up. Sometimes those stories have an ending that nobody planned for. And sometimes that ending comes on a Thursday morning in a mess hall in less than 4 seconds. And sometimes the person who delivers it is someone nobody was watching, until they had no choice. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then it broke, not with shouting, not with chaos, but with something stranger and more unsettling. The low collective exhale of over 1,000 people releasing a breath they hadn't known they were holding, followed immediately by the kind of murmuring that spreads through a crowd, the way fire spreads through dry grass, fast, unstoppable, and impossible to contain once it has started. Marcus Rodriguez was on the floor. That was the fact that nobody's brain could fully process. Not because it was physically impossible a trained fighter could always be taken down. Every SEAL knew that it was day one of combatives training, but because of who it was, because of what it meant. Because the man on the floor was not just any soldier, not just any decorated veteran. He was the man this base had spent 15 years constructing a mythology around brick by brick, story by story, until the myth and the man had become indistinguishable. And myths in the military don't hit the floor, except this one just had. Sarah Chen stood exactly where she had been standing. She had not moved backward. She had not adopted a defensive posture. She was simply standing, her notebook in her hand, her breathing steady, her expression carrying the particular neutrality of someone who has just completed a task that needed completing and is now waiting for the next thing to occur. Rodriguez was trying to breathe. The boot to the solar plexus had done exactly what it was designed to do, temporarily interrupted the body's ability to process air, a sensation that every person who has experienced it describes the same way, like the world suddenly forgot that oxygen exists. He was conscious. He was alert. He was absolutely, completely unable to move with any speed or purpose. "Don't," Sarah said quietly as he started to push himself up on one arm. Not a threat, not a command exactly, more like advice. The kind of advice that carries the clear implication that ignoring it would be a decision the person would regret. He stopped. Sergeant First Class Dominguez was on his feet without having consciously decided to stand. He was 3 tables away, and he was staring, and the expression on his face was one that his team members had never seen before. Not in the field, not in training, not in 15 years of watching the man navigate every situation, with the absolute composure of someone who had seen everything worth seeing. He had not seen this. "What in the—" he started and then stopped because there were no words in his vocabulary that were both accurate and appropriate for the current situation. Private Delacroix had both hands pressed flat on the table in front of him, as though the table were the only stable surface in a world that had just lost its structural integrity. He was 19 years old, and he had spent 3 weeks watching Staff Sergeant Rodriguez occupy every room he entered like a force of nature. And what he was looking at right now did not fit inside any framework he had been given for understanding how the world worked. Did she just? Delacroix turned to the corporal beside him, whose name was Whitfield. And Whitfield nodded once very slowly with the expression of a man confirming a diagnosis he had hoped would come back negative. "She did," Whitfield said, "but I know what he is." Rodriguez found his voice before he found his feet. You have any idea what you just did?" The words came out broken, interrupted by the effort of breathing, but the anger in them was whole and undamaged. "You put your hands on a Navy SEAL. You have any idea? Any idea what that means? What's coming for you?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. She pulled out the chair she had been sitting in before any of this started and sat back down. The deliberateness of it, the calm, the normality of it, sitting back down as though she had merely paused a task rather than just dropped a legend, hit the room harder than the takedown had. "I want her name," Rodriguez said, and now he was talking to the soldiers around him who were still processing the situation. "Somebody get me her name. Somebody get me her commanding officer." Right now, nobody moved. Not because they didn't want to help, not because they were afraid of the woman in the chair, but because there are moments when a crowd without communication or coordination collectively arrives at the instinct that intervention would be a mistake, that the situation has a gravity of its own that should not be disturbed. This was one of those moments. "Rodriguez!" The voice came from the right side of the mess hall, cutting through the murmur with the clean authority of a blade. Everyone turned. Major Jennifer Walsh was not a large woman. She was 5'6", lean, with the kind of posture that communicated competence more effectively than any insignia on her uniform. She was the base's senior military police officer, and she had been in the mess hall since 0700, which meant she had seen the entire sequence of events from approximately 40 feet away, which meant she had the kind of comprehensive situational picture that made her movement toward the east wall table now very deliberate and very unhurried. She stopped in front of Rodriguez, who had by now gotten himself to a sitting position on the floor, one hand pressed to his sternum, his face carrying the complex expression of a man simultaneously managing physical pain, profound disorientation, and a fury so large it had nowhere to go. "Major," he said, and there was something almost desperate in the word, the sound of a man reaching for the familiar structures of military hierarchy because the floor beneath him had ceased to be reliable. "Don't," Walsh said. The same words Sarah had used, the same quiet weight. Rodriguez closed his mouth. Walsh turned to Sarah. There was a pause, a very specific kind of pause, the kind that contains a whole conversation in the space between two heartbeats. "Agent Chen," Walsh said. "Not miss, not ma'am, not the vague, provisional form of address you use for a civilian whose status you haven't established. Agent." The word landed in the mess hall like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples moved outward through the crowd in real time, visible, audible in the change in people's faces, in the way conversations stopped and restarted differently, in the sudden collective recalibration of every person who had spent the last 4 minutes watching this scene and constructing their understanding of it. Agent. Rodriguez heard it. The fury in his face flickered just for a moment, just a single frame, and underneath it something else appeared. Something that looked to the people close enough to see it remarkably like the beginning of fear. Major Walsh, Sarah said. She handed a small credential wallet across the table open. Walsh looked at it for exactly 2 seconds, then handed it back. Your credentials are in order, Walsh said, as I was informed they would be. You were informed, Rodriguez said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, the words of a man rearranging a puzzle and not liking the picture forming. 24 hours ago, Walsh said, and now she turned to look at him fully with the expression of a commanding officer who has arrived at a scene of damage and is beginning the assessment. Which means that your presence at this table this morning was not, as I'm going to charitably assume you intended, a formal security challenge. It was personal. Rodriguez opened his mouth. Don't, Walsh said for the second time, and this time there was nothing charitable in it. Around them, the mess hall had developed the quality of a theater, not the rowdy, chaotic energy of a crowd witnessing a fight, but the focused, held-breath attention of an audience watching a scene they know is significant and don't want to miss a word of. People who had been heading for the exit had stopped. People who had finished eating were still at their tables. Cooks had come to the serving counter and were standing there watching. Dominguez moved through the crowd and crouched down next to Rodriguez. Marcus, he said quietly, talk to me. What happened? She was sitting here, Rodriguez said, and his voice had dropped, now lost its command register, gone down into something rawer. She didn't. I asked her a question. She didn't acknowledge you, Dominguez said. Not an accusation, a completion. Rodriguez's jaw tightened. Marcus, Dominguez's voice was careful. Tell me you didn't do this because she didn't acknowledge you. Silence. It was the silence that answered. Dominguez closed his eyes briefly. God help you, he said, very quietly. God help you. Sarah had been writing in her notebook throughout this exchange. Not ignoring it, there was no indication that she missed a single word, but recording it in the small, neat, precise handwriting of someone who has been trained to document things in real time in the middle of chaos, without losing the thread of either the documentation or the situation. For the record, she said, not looking up, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached this table at approximately 0742. He made several attempts to compel identification through social pressure. When those attempts failed, he initiated physical contact by seizing my right forearm. I responded with a defensive technique consistent with my training and proportional to the threat presented. I have 3 witnesses who were within 10 feet of this table throughout the entire exchange. She looked up. Does anyone dispute that summary? Nobody disputed it. Rodriguez got to his feet. It cost him physically, and in every other way it cost him. But he got there standing at his full height, and for a moment the old gravity reasserted itself, the sheer physical reality of him commanding the space. But something was different now. Everyone could feel it. Something in the architecture of the room had changed. Some invisible load-bearing wall had been removed, and the structure that remained was standing but differently. I want to know, he said, and his voice was controlled, now pulled back to a professional register with visible effort. Exactly what on exactly what authority and exactly what... You don't have the clearance for that, Sarah said. 3 words, quiet, factual, carrying no malice at all, just information. Rodriguez stared at her. I just want to be clear about that, she continued. It's not a judgment, it's a classification level. The investigation I'm attached to operates above your current access tier. That's a bureaucratic reality, not a personal statement. Walsh had taken out her own notebook. She looked at Rodriguez. I'm going to need your sidearm, she said. The mess hall went still again. Rodriguez turned to Walsh slowly. Major. Standard procedure following a physical altercation involving an active investigation, Walsh said. You know this. I was the one who was. You initiated physical contact with a federal agent, Walsh said, and now every trace of charity was gone from her voice, replaced by the clean, unarguable language of procedure and fact. Your sidearm, Sergeant. It took him 11 seconds. Everyone counted. Nobody would admit to counting, but everyone did, and the number 11 would appear in at least 6 different conversations that evening in barracks across the base. 11 seconds of Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez standing completely still, while the mess hall watched and the silence pressed down, and the reality of the situation arranged itself around him like walls closing in. Then he unholstered his weapon and handed it to Walsh. Private Delacroix at his table looked like someone had just told him Santa Claus wasn't real. Whitfield beside him had the expression of a man watching a building he'd always assumed was solid reveal that it had been built on sand. "I need to make a call," Rodriguez said. "After your statement," Walsh said. "I need to make a call first." "After your statement, Sergeant." Another silence. This one shorter 5 seconds, not 11 but heavier in its way because it was the silence of a man understanding that the levers he had always been able to pull were not working, that the machinery of his reputation and his rank and his record, which had always produced the outcomes he needed, was producing nothing right now but the sound of its own failure. "Fine," he said. Walsh directed him toward a table on the far side of the mess hall, away from Sarah and 2 military police officers who had appeared in the doorway, with the timing of people who had been waiting for this, accompanied him. The crowd parted, not with the deference they had shown when he'd walked in an hour ago, but with the different, more complicated attention of people watching something that they know they will be talking about for years. Dominguez followed because that's what you do for a man in your unit when his world is coming apart. You follow him even when you can see that he built the thing that's collapsing. At the east wall table, Sarah finished writing her notes, closed her notebook, and picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway with the particular pragmatism of someone who has long since stopped requiring comfort from small things. A young specialist named Torres, who had been sitting close enough to have heard every word of every exchange, leaned toward her slightly. She was 23, had been in the service 2 years, and she had spent both of those years navigating the particular landscape of being a young woman in spaces where the Marcus Rodriguezes of the world set the tone. "Excuse me," Torres said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Sarah looked at her. Are you okay?" Sarah considered the question with the same seriousness she had given to every other question she'd been asked that morning. "Yes," she said. "Thank you for asking." Torres nodded, started to turn away, then turned back. "How did you know he was going to grab you?" "I didn't know," Sarah said. "I assessed the probability based on behavioral indicators. The escalating language, the closed body posture, the way he was managing the audience." She paused. "He needed to win in front of people. Men who need to win in front of people will always eventually reach for something physical when the verbal isn't working." Torres absorbed this. "And you were ready." "I'm always ready," Sarah said. No bravado in it, no performance. Just a fact stated simply by a person for whom readiness was not a posture, but a permanent condition. Torres sat back. She looked across the mess hall at Rodriguez, who was sitting with Walsh and the MPs, his hands flat on the table, his size somehow less than it had been an hour ago, not physically, but in every way that mattered. "What happens to him now?" Torres asked. Sarah picked up her pen, opened her notebook again. "That depends on him," she said, "and on what we find." And there it was, the sentence that landed differently than everything that had preceded it, that sent a different kind of quiet through the people close enough to hear it. Not the quiet of shock, not the quiet of witnessing something unprecedented, but the quiet of understanding that this morning was not the event. This morning was the beginning of an event. That the woman in the civilian clothes had not arrived at Camp Lejeune for breakfast in a confrontation with a legendary SEAL. She had arrived for something larger. Something that had been in motion before any of them walked into this building today. Something that the scene they just witnessed was not the climax of, but the opening of. What we find. Rodriguez heard it. He was 40 feet away and his back was to her table, but in the silence of that moment, the way sound travels in a room where no one is making unnecessary noise, he heard it. And the way his shoulders shifted, the barely perceptible tightening of a man who has suddenly understood that the floor falling out beneath him is not a metaphor, but a process, told everyone who was watching that he had heard it too. Walsh, sitting across from him, watched his face carefully. She had been doing this job for 18 years. She had seen decorated officers fall before. She had watched men with impressive records discover that a record is a document, not a shield. But there was something different about watching a man with the psyche and history and mythology of Marcus Rodriguez arrive at the moment where he understood that the story he had been telling about himself to others, and more importantly to himself, had a gap in it. A significant gap. The kind that once found cannot be unfound. Sergeant Rodriguez, Walsh said quietly, leaning forward so that her voice didn't carry. I'm going to ask you something and I need you to think before you answer. Because the answer you give me in the next 30 seconds is going to shape the next 6 months of your life. Rodriguez looked at her. How many times, Walsh said, has something like this morning happened before? Not the physical altercation, the pattern, the approach, the need to establish dominance with someone who didn't give it to you automatically. Rodriguez said nothing. Take your time, Walsh said, but understand that Agent Chen is sitting 40 feet away documenting everything she observed today, and she arrived on this base 24 hours ago, which means she has already been observing for 24 hours before this morning, and whatever she observed in those 24 hours is already in her notes. Rodriguez's hands flat on the table pressed slightly harder against the surface. A small movement. Walsh saw it. So I'll ask again, she said. How many times? The mess hall continued its complicated life around them. The noise gradually returning, the conversations resuming the machinery of 1,000 people's daily routines, reasserting itself over the extraordinary thing that had happened in the last 20 minutes. But in the particular gravity well of that table where a major and a decorated sergeant and 2 military police officers sat with the weight of something unspoken between them, the ordinary noise of the world felt very far away. Rodriguez's jaw moved. More than once, he said. Walsh wrote it down. And Sarah Chen, 40 feet away with her cold coffee and her notebook and her precise, unhurried handwriting, wrote it down too, though she hadn't heard it, couldn't have heard it. She was writing something else entirely. Something she had already known before she walked into the mess hall that morning. Something that had nothing to do with breakfast and everything to do with why she was here. The investigation that nobody in this room except Walsh knew the shape of had just moved from its opening phase to something considerably more serious. And the man who had walked into the mess hall that morning, expecting to be the most powerful person in it, was beginning to understand with the slow and terrible clarity of a dawn that cannot be stopped, that the woman who hadn't looked up when he walked past her had not been ignoring him. She had been waiting for him. Walsh wrote it down, capped her pen, and looked at Rodriguez for a long moment without speaking. That kind of silence, the silence of someone who has just received a confirmation they were hoping not to receive, is its own form of communication. Rodriguez felt it land. He felt it the way you feel a diagnosis, not in the hearing of the words, but in the space after them when the words stop and the reality begins. More than once, he had said, 2 words. Quiet, almost involuntary, the kind of admission that comes out before the self-protective instinct can intercept it. Walsh had written them down and capped her pen, and now she was looking at him with the expression of someone who understands that what is about to happen cannot be stopped, only managed, and that the quality of the management depends entirely on what the man across the table chooses to do in the next several minutes. I'm going to give you some advice, Walsh said, and I need you to hear it as someone who has watched good careers end badly, not as someone who is against you. Because I am not against you, Marcus. I want to be very clear about that. Rodriguez's eyes moved to her face. Something shifted in them, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, the way a door opens when someone knocks, who doesn't sound like a threat. Whatever you know, Walsh said, whatever you think Agent Chen does or doesn't have, assume she has more. Because in my experience, people who arrive on a base 24 hours before an incident and position themselves in the exact location where the incident occurs are not here by coincidence. They are here because they already know the shape of something and they are waiting for it to show itself. Rodriguez absorbed this without speaking, which means this morning was not the beginning of your problem, Walsh said. This morning was the moment your problem became visible. There is a significant difference. Across the mess hall, Sarah had closed her notebook and was on her phone. Not texting, speaking quietly with the focused economy of someone delivering a debrief to someone who already knows the context. Her voice didn't carry. Her expression gave nothing away. But Walsh, watching from 40 feet, recognized the posture. She had made calls like that herself, calls to people above the local chain, calls that set things in motion that could not easily be stopped once started. It was 0813. 31 minutes had passed since Tank Rodriguez walked into the mess hall, expecting the morning to be unremarkable. Dominguez was sitting 2 seats down from Rodriguez, not because Walsh had invited him, but because he had simply not left and no one had told him to. He was a sergeant first class with 17 years in, and he had the particular survival instinct of a career military man, the instinct that tells you when a situation is above your weight class and when staying close to it is either very smart or very dangerous, and the further instinct that tells you which of those it is. Right now, he wasn't sure, but he stayed. "Marcus," Dominguez said quietly. Walsh had turned slightly, taking a call of her own, and the two men had a momentary pocket of relative privacy. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Rodriguez looked at him. "Petty Officer Simmons," Dominguez said. "Last March. What actually happened?" The name hit Rodriguez like a physical thing. His jaw tightened. His eyes went flat, not the flatness of innocence, but the flatness of a man who has rehearsed a particular response to a particular question so many times that the rehearsal has calcified into something he can produce without thinking. "That situation was resolved," Rodriguez said. "It was closed," Dominguez said. "Closed and resolved are different things, and you know it." Dominguez. "And Corporal Hayes, 2 years ago, and the civilian contractor whose name I never got, but who submitted a complaint that disappeared inside 6 weeks. Dominguez's voice was still low, still contained, but there was something in it now that hadn't been there before. Not accusation, but a kind of tired reckoning, the sound of a man who has been carrying a discomfort he couldn't name for a long time and has just found the word for it. "I told myself those were separate things, Marcus. I told myself they were misunderstandings. Because you were," he stopped, started again. "Because of who you are, what you've done, I told myself the record spoke for itself." Rodriguez said nothing. "But she was waiting for you," Dominguez said. "That's what Walsh just told you. She was already here. She already knew something. Which means those things I told myself were separate. They're not separate, are they?" It wasn't a question. Rodriguez pressed his hands flat on the table again, the same small movement Walsh had noticed earlier. And Dominguez noticed it too, the contained force of a man who was holding something large very still. "This conversation is done," Rodriguez said. "Marcus." "Done, Hector." Dominguez sat back. He looked at the table for a moment, then looked across the mess hall at Sarah Chen, who had finished her call and was now sitting with her notebook open again, writing unhurried present as though the morning had returned to its ordinary shape, and she had simply resumed the task the morning had interrupted. "God help you," Dominguez said again. But this time he wasn't talking about the legal situation. He was talking about something else. The thing that happens when a man who has been a certain kind of person for a very long time is forced to look directly at the cost of being that person. The reckoning, not the legal one, the human one. He stood up and walked away. Rodriguez watched him go. At 08:21, two things happened simultaneously that changed the geometry of the morning again. The first was that Captain David Mercer walked into the mess hall. Mercer was Rodriguez's commanding officer, 44 combat veteran, a man with his own impressive record and his own deeply established understanding of how the military machine worked and what it required of the people inside it. He had been notified at 08:05 by Walsh's office, and the 11 minutes between notification and arrival had clearly been 11 minutes of very focused preparation, because he walked in with the contained, forward-moving energy of a man who has decided exactly what he is going to do and is in the process of doing it. He crossed the mess hall without looking at Rodriguez, went directly to Sarah's table. Sarah looked up, closed her notebook with the same deliberate precision she used for everything, and stood. The mess hall, which had spent the last 20 minutes gradually returning to something approximating its normal noise level, went quiet again. Not completely. There were still hundreds of people moving, eating, talking, but in the focused, attentive way of a crowd that has learned that this particular table, this particular woman, is the center of gravity of the morning's events and should be monitored. Mercer extended his hand. "Agent Chen, Captain David Mercer, I apologize for not being here to meet you properly yesterday." "Captain," Sarah said. She shook his hand. "I've been briefed on the incident this morning," Mercer said. "I want to assure you that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's conduct does not reflect—" "Captain," Sarah said, not unkindly, "I appreciate that, but I need you to know that the incident this morning is peripheral to why I'm here. It's relevant, but it's not the subject of my investigation." Mercer absorbed this. "Then what is the subject?" That's the part I need to brief you on privately, Sarah said. At your earliest convenience. My office, 20 minutes. 10, Sarah said. A beat. 10 Mercer agreed. That was the first thing that happened at 0821. The second was that Private Delacroix's phone buzzed. He looked at it under the table, a message from a friend in a different unit 45 minutes away across the base. The message said, heard something happened in the Lejeune mess hall this morning. What's going on? Delacroix stared at the message for a moment. Then he looked up at the mess hall around him, at the MPs still positioned near the exit at Rodriguez, still sitting alone at his table at the woman who had put him there, now standing and talking with his commanding officer as though the two of them had a prior arrangement. He typed back, "You have no idea." He was right. The person 45 minutes away had no idea. But they would. Within 4 hours, the general shape of what had happened in the mess hall at Camp Lejeune at 0742 on a Thursday morning would have traveled to 6 other installations, reached the ears of 2 congressmen's aides, and appeared in fragmented and not entirely accurate form on 3 different message boards frequented by active and retired military personnel. The military information ecosystem is in certain respects the most efficient gossip network in the world. A story involving a legendary SEAL, a woman who put him on the floor in 4 seconds, in a federal investigation that nobody knew the shape of, yet that kind of story moved at a speed that no official communication could match. At 0829, Rodriguez was escorted by the 2 MPs to a private room adjacent to the mess hall for formal statement collection. Walsh walked with them. Rodriguez walked with the particular posture of a man who is maintaining a physical dignity that his situation is no longer supporting. Shoulders back, chin level, the trained bearing of a decorated soldier applied to a walk that felt to everyone watching. Less like a warrior moving through his domain, and more like a man being led somewhere he did not choose to go. Specialist Torres watched him pass. She thought about what Sarah had said. Men who need to win in front of people will always eventually reach for something physical when the verbal isn't working. And she thought about the times in the past 2 years when she had felt the shape of that need in her vicinity and had adjusted herself to accommodate it, had made herself smaller, less visible, less of a challenge, had done it automatically without thinking, the way you lean away from heat without deciding to. She was thinking about that, sitting with the specific discomfort of that thought, when the corporal beside her said something that she almost missed. "You know what the crazy part is?" Whitfield said. "What?" "The guys in his unit, the people who've served with him for years." Whitfield shook his head. "Half of them looked surprised, the other half didn't." Torres thought about that. "Which half was Dominguez?" Whitfield said nothing, which was its own answer. In the private room adjacent to the mess hall, Rodriguez sat across from Walsh and gave his formal statement. He was precise. He was controlled. He was everything that 15 years of military training had made him when it came to official documentation, such accurate about the sequence of events, careful with language, demonstrating exactly the procedural competence that had contributed to his decorated record. He did not minimize what he had done. He did not exactly explain it. He stated it. Walsh listened, wrote, asked the specific targeted questions that formal investigation protocol required. And when he was done, she set her pen down and looked at him. "I need to ask you about Petty Officer Simmons," she said. The room changed. Rodriguez's face went through 3 expressions in less than 2 seconds: surprise, then control, and then the particular blankness of a man who has decided that blankness is the safest available option. "That matter was resolved," he said. "It was closed," Walsh said. "I'm going to use Dominguez's distinction because it's the right one." "How do you know what Dominguez?" Rodriguez stopped, looked at Walsh, looked at the table, understood. "The mess hall," he said, and the whole conversation. "You were in a public space," Walsh said simply. "I wasn't eavesdropping. I was standing 20 feet away." Rodriguez said nothing for a long time. The kind of nothing that is not empty but full of the activity of a mind working through a problem, testing exits, finding them closed, testing again. "What does Chen have?" he finally said. It came out quieter than he intended, something stripped of its command register, something that sounded almost like a question, a person asks when they are genuinely uncertain rather than tactically probing. "I don't have access to her full investigative file," Walsh said, "but I can tell you that she requested base access 24 hours before this morning, that her clearance was verified at a level that required me to contact the Pentagon duty officer personally, and that Captain Mercer was briefed on her presence by someone above his chain of command. She paused. I can also tell you that in 20 years of military police work, I have never been contacted by someone at that level about a routine investigation. Rodriguez stared at the table. Simmons wasn't the only one, Walsh said carefully. Not accusingly, in the tone of someone who already has a document in front of them and is offering the subject of the document an opportunity to confirm or contextualize before the document becomes the only record. Rodriguez's hands pressed flat on the table. Is that a question, he said. It's an observation, Walsh said. You can respond to it however you choose. Silence. Long. The specific silence of a man standing at a threshold, the threshold between the version of the story he has been telling and the version that is now being assembled by someone else from documentation and witness statements, and the careful patience of an investigation that had been building before he ever walked into that mess hall. I need a lawyer, Rodriguez said. Yes, Walsh said. Oh, you do. She said it without satisfaction, without judgment, with the simple, steady honesty of someone who has been in this room, metaphorically or literally enough times to know that this moment, the moment when a person finally asks for what they should have asked for at the beginning, is not a victory for anyone. It is just the point where the next phase starts. She closed her notebook, stood up. I'll have someone contact JAG. Walsh. She stopped at the door. How long has she been building this? Rodriguez asked. Chen, how long has this investigation been running? Walsh considered the question, considered whether to answer it, decided that the truth at this point was the only thing with any utility. Based on what the Pentagon duty officer indicated when I spoke with him yesterday, she said at least 14 months. The number hit Rodriguez the way numbers hit people when they reveal something about time, not just the quantity of it, but the quality. 14 months of something building while he walked through rooms believing he was the most powerful person in them. 14 months of files and statements and documentation accumulating while he stood in formation and received commendations and told himself that his record was who he was. 14 months of a woman he had never heard of working at a level he couldn't access, putting together the shape of something he had convinced himself had no shape. She was waiting for me, he said, repeating Walsh's words from earlier, but differently, not receiving information this time, but arriving at understanding. The specific, terrible understanding of a man who has just seen the whole board and realized that he has been playing the wrong game. Yes, Walsh said, she was. She left. Rodriguez sat alone in the room and looked at his hands, the same hands that had reached for Sarah Chen's arm in front of 1,000 people, the same hands that had 2 silver stars behind them, the same hands that had done things in the dark of 3 combat tours that nobody outside those tours would ever fully understand. He looked at his hands and tried to recognize them. Outside in the mess hall, the morning had moved past the shock of the incident and into the particular charged atmosphere of a large group of people processing something together without being able to talk about it directly. People ate and talked about other things, but underneath the ordinary conversation was the persistent, low-frequency hum of a collective awareness something real had happened here. Not just the physical confrontation that was a story, a remarkable story, one that would be told for years, but something underneath the story, something that the word agent in the phrase 14 months and the look on Dominguez's face when he walked away from Rodriguez all pointed toward, something that was not finished. Sarah came back from Mercer's office at 09:12. She moved through the mess hall without drawing the attention she had drawn before, or rather she drew exactly the same attention, but the people giving it were better at hiding that they were giving it. She sat back at the east wall table, opened her notebook, and continued the task that Tank Rodriguez had interrupted 90 minutes earlier. Torres watched her from across the room. She thought about approaching her again, had the thought held it, considered it. Then she thought about Simmons, whose first name she didn't know, whose situation she had heard about in the vague third-hand way that information travels through a military base when everyone knows something happened, but the official version says nothing happened. She thought about Hayes. She thought about the contractor, whose name nobody seemed to know. She thought about all the women in all the rooms where the Marcus Rodriguezes of the world had been the loudest thing and therefore the most real thing by the simple physics of volume and size, and the authority that had been handed to certain people for so long that everyone had forgotten it was handed, assumed it was inherent. She picked up her tray, walked across the mess hall. sat down across from Sarah Chen. Sarah looked up. I have something to tell you, Torres said. Her voice was steady. Her hands flat on the table were not. About something I saw 8 months ago. I didn't report it because I didn't think anyone would. She stopped, started again. I didn't think it would matter. Sarah held her gaze, set down her pen, gave her full, complete, unhurried attention to the 23-year-old specialist sitting across from her with her shaking hands and her steady voice. It matters, Sarah said, and she opened her notebook to a fresh page. Torres talked for 22 minutes. She didn't stop once. She didn't qualify, didn't hedge, didn't use the careful, self-protective language that people use when they are telling a truth they are afraid will be used against them. She just talked in the direct, slightly too fast way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has finally found the right container for it. Her hands stopped shaking after the first 3 minutes. Her voice never wavered at all. Sarah wrote everything down. She asked 4 questions, not to redirect, not to challenge, but to clarify specific details, dates, locations, the names of people who had been present. Each question was precise, surgical. The kind of question that reveals that the person asking it already has a framework and is slotting new information into it rather than building one from scratch. When Torres finished, Sarah read back her notes. Not the whole thing, the key points, the specific incidents, the names and dates. Torres confirmed each one, corrected 2 small details, confirmed the rest. Thank you, Sarah said. That's it, Torres said. Not disappointed, surprised. She had expected more ceremony around the moment, some formal acknowledgement of the weight of what she just handed over. That's the beginning, Sarah said. Someone from my team will follow up with you within 48 hours for a formal recorded statement. Between now and then, I need you to write down everything you just told me, your own words, your own account, exactly as you remember it. Don't talk to anyone else about it first. Don't compare notes. Don't let anyone tell you what you saw or didn't see. Torres nodded. And Torres, Sarah met her eyes directly. What you just did took more than you think it did. I want you to know that. Torres stood up. She felt lighter and heavier, simultaneously lighter, because the thing she'd been carrying had been set down heavier, because setting it down had made its weight real in a way that carrying it hadn't. She walked back to her table. Whitfield looked at her and didn't ask. That was either respect or fear, and right now, she didn't care which. It was 0941. 2 hours since Rodriguez had walked in. The mess hall had mostly cleared by now. The breakfast rush was long past the tables occupied by the late arrivals and the people who lingered. The ordinary life of the base had resumed its pull on the 1,000 people who had witnessed the morning's events, drawing them back to their duties, their units, their routines. But the events themselves had not resumed ordinariness. They had simply moved to different rooms. In the JAG office, Rodriguez sat with Captain Elaine Foster, a military defense attorney, with 12 years of experience in the particular quality of composure that comes from having sat across from enough people in the worst moments of their military careers that the moments no longer surprise her. She had reviewed the incident report, the formal statement Rodriguez had given Walsh, and the preliminary charge document that Walsh's office had filed 40 minutes earlier. She set the documents down and looked at Rodriguez. Tell me about Petty Officer Simmons, she said. Rodriguez said nothing. Marcus, she said, dropping the rank in the way that attorneys do when they need a person to understand they are talking to them, not their file. I cannot help you if I don't have the full picture. And I need to have the full picture before Agent Chen's team does, which based on the timeline I'm looking at means I needed it about 14 months ago. She paused. So tell me about Simmons. Tell me about Hayes. Tell me about the contractor in 2022. Tell me about all of it, starting from the beginning, and don't leave anything out because you think it makes you look bad. I already know it makes you look bad. That's why I need to hear it. Rodriguez looked at his hands again. The same gesture as before, that downward look, that particular stillness. But it was different now. In the mess hall, it had been the look of a man containing force. In this room, it was something else. The look of a man confronting inventory. It started, he said slowly, with Simmons. Foster said nothing, waited. She was assigned to my unit in 2021. Good sailor, sharp. She had a mouth on her, not disrespectful, just she had opinions and she wasn't quiet about them, which I respected actually at first. He stopped, seemed to be deciding something, then kept going. There was an incident in the training facility. I made a comment that she pushed back on. In front of the unit, in front of people who'd never seen anyone push back on me. What kind of comment? Foster asked. The kind that I told myself was humor, Rodriguez said. The bluntness of it surprised even him coming out of his mouth. The kind that only sounds like humor if you're not the one it's about. Foster wrote something, and when she pushed back, I made it hard for her, Rodriguez said. Not officially, nothing that would show up clean in a file, but in the ways that you can make things hard for someone in a unit when you're the one who sets the tone. Extra details, better assignments going to other people. Small things. Consistent things. He paused. She filed a complaint. It went through the process. The process closed without action, Foster said. Yes, because your commanding officer at the time was Colonel Peterson. Rodriguez looked at her sharply. How do you know that? Because I've been doing this job for 12 years, Foster said, and I know how things move in this building and who makes them move that way. Peterson closed 3 complaints in 18 months, all against decorated operators, all closed without action. She set her pen down. What I'm telling you, Marcus, is that the system that protected you is also the system that Chen has been investigating. You are not the only subject of her inquiry. You may not even be the primary one, but this morning made you the most visible one. The room shifted. Rodriguez stared at her. Peterson is part of this. I don't know the full scope of her investigation, Foster said carefully, but I know that a DIA agent operating at that clearance level with 14 months of active inquiry is not here for one staff sergeant, even a decorated one. The implications of that moved through Rodriguez slowly, the way cold water moves through a system, not fast but thorough, reaching every part. He had walked into the mess hall that morning, believing he was the protagonist of the story he was living in. He was now understanding with a completeness that was genuinely new, that he was a chapter. Possibly not even the most important one. She used me, he said, not with anger, with something more complicated. The complicated feeling of a man who has been outmaneuvered so completely that the outmaneuvering has acquired a kind of clarity that he cannot help but recognize even while it dismantles him. She didn't manufacture your behavior, Foster said precisely. She positioned herself where your behavior was predictable. There's a distinction. That's not a better feeling. No, Foster said, it isn't. At 10:03, Sarah Chen walked into Captain Mercer's office for the second time that morning. This time she was accompanied by a man nobody had seen before, mid-40s, civilian clothes, the particular quality of stillness that comes from a career spent in rooms where the stakes are very high and visible reaction is a liability. His name was not introduced. He sat to Sarah's left and placed a tablet on Mercer's desk. Mercer looked at the tablet, then at Sarah, then at the man whose name had not been given. What am I looking at? Mercer said. A summary of an 18-month investigation into a pattern of misconduct involving 8 active duty personnel assigned to or previously assigned to this installation, Sarah said. 3 of them are currently under separate investigation by the Inspector General's office. 2 have already been separated from service in the past 6 months under circumstances that were characterized publicly as administrative, but were connected to this inquiry. Mercer sat back. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah continued, is the most recent and now the most documented case in the series. What happened this morning in the mess hall was not an isolated incident. It was the latest in a pattern that includes documented harassment of subordinates, retaliatory action against personnel who filed complaints, and the use of his rank and reputation to create an environment in which those complaints were unlikely to be pursued. The complaints that were closed, Mercer said. The complaints that were closed by Colonel Peterson, Sarah said. The name landed in the room with the weight of something that had been waiting to be dropped. Mercer was quiet for a very long time. He was a man who had spent his career inside the institution, who understood both its genuine nobility and its genuine failures, who had navigated the complicated territory between them with the pragmatic integrity of someone who believes that systems can be corrected from within if the people within them are willing to pay the cost of correction. He was looking at a document that told him the cost of not correcting had been accumulating for 18 months in the careers and well-being of people under his command, and that the accounting was now due. Peterson is at the Pentagon, Mercer said. Yes, Sarah said. This goes up to the Pentagon. It went up to the Pentagon 14 months ago, Sarah said. That's where the inquiry originated. Another silence. Mercer looked at the unnamed man. He's here to facilitate the formal notification process, Sarah said, and to ensure continuity of the investigation now that the operational phase has begun. The operational phase, Mercer said slowly. This morning was the beginning of the visible phase, Sarah said. We've been in the documentation phase for over a year. Everything that happens from here is formal recorded and subject to oversight from the Inspector General's office and the relevant congressional subcommittee. The word congressional moved through Mercer the way the word Peterson had moved through Rodriguez, not loudly but deeply reaching the structural level. What do you need from me? Mercer said. It was not a surrender. It was the question of a man who has decided clearly and without drama which side of history he wants to be on. Full cooperation, Sarah said. Access to personnel files, communication records, and duty logs for the 8 individuals in the summary, voluntary statements from witnesses to this morning's incident, and the suspension of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez pending the outcome of the formal charges. Suspension is automatic given this morning's incident, Mercer said. I know, I'm being thorough. What about Rodriguez's team, his unit? His unit continues its operations normally, Sarah said. This is not a unit investigation. It's an individual pattern of conduct investigation that has unit implications. The distinction matters for morale and for the integrity of the unit's ongoing mission. Mercer nodded. He was already reaching for his phone. Then he stopped, looked at Sarah directly for the first time since she'd placed the summary on his desk. How many people knew this was coming? He asked. On the investigative side, how many people were read in? Enough to do the work, Sarah said. Few enough to protect it. Walsh knew. Walsh was notified 24 hours ago that I would be on base. She was not told the scope of the inquiry. And this morning in the mess hall, you could have avoided it, the confrontation. You saw him come in. Sarah held his gaze. There was a pause, a specific weighted pause of the kind that contains a choice about how honest to be. Yes, she said, you let it happen. I gave him every opportunity to walk away, she said. 3 times. Clearly and directly. What he chose to do after those opportunities is the documentation of a pattern, not the manufacture of one. There is a difference, Captain. I want to be clear about that difference. Mercer held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and picked up his phone. In the JAG office, Rodriguez had been talking for 40 minutes. Foster had 3 pages of notes in the expression of a woman whose job has just become significantly more complicated and significantly more serious simultaneously. She had asked 17 clarifying questions. She had not interrupted once. When Rodriguez stopped talking, the room was quiet for a full 30 seconds. Okay, Foster said finally. Okay, Rodriguez said. What does that mean? It means I have a lot of work to do, Foster said. It means the incident this morning by itself is serious but manageable. What you've just told me about the preceding 2 years is a different category of problem. She paused. It also means that how you conduct yourself from this moment forward is going to matter more than anything that's already happened. More than the commendations, more than the record, because the record is what made you worth 14 months of investigation. Your conduct going forward is what determines what the investigation ultimately produces. Rodriguez looked at her. You're telling me to cooperate. I'm telling you that the choice between cooperation and resistance is the most consequential decision you will make in your military career, and you have about 4 hours to make it before the formal charges are filed and the decision is made for you by circumstance. If you cooperate fully candidly and without further incidents, there is a conversation to be had about the difference between a man who made serious mistakes over a period of years and a man who compounded those mistakes by obstructing an investigation. She put her pen down. You are currently the first man. Don't become the second. Rodriguez stared at the wall. Something was happening in his face that was difficult to watch and impossible to look away from the particular private process of a person disassembling a self-image that they have held for a very long time. It is not a graceful process. It is not a fast one. But it is, when it happens, genuinely unmistakable. Simmons, he said quietly, does she know about this investigation? I don't know, Foster said. She should know, Rodriguez said. The words came out rough, like something that had been stored in a damaged container. What happened to her, what I did to her, she should know that it's being that someone is, he stopped. She filed that complaint and nothing happened, and she had to just keep serving in the same unit with me like nothing happened, and I never, he stopped again. Foster watched him carefully. I never thought about what that cost her, he said. I thought about what her complaint cost me. I never thought about what my response cost her. It was the most honest thing he had said all morning. Possibly the most honest thing he had said in years. It arrived in the room without decoration, without strategy, without any of the performance that had characterized the rest of his morning, the commanding presence, the rehearsed responses, the tactical blankness. It arrived bare the way the truest things do, because there is no point in dressing them. Foster wrote it down, not for the investigation, just because some things deserve to be recorded. At 10:47, the formal suspension order was delivered to Rodriguez in the JAG office. He signed the acknowledgement without speaking. His sidearm, already held by Walsh, was officially logged as evidence. His access credentials were administratively suspended pending the outcome of the formal inquiry. He was not escorted off base. He was not led anywhere in handcuffs. He was a decorated veteran with 2 Silver Stars and 3 combat tours, and the system that was now holding him accountable was the same system he had served for 15 years, and it treated him with the procedural dignity that service warranted, even as it dismantled the structure of privilege he had built on top of it. He walked out of the JAG office at 10:53 into a base that knew. Not officially, the formal announcements would come later, carefully worded, focused on the procedural and the factual, but in the way that 1,000 people who witnessed something real know the shape of what happened, even when the official language hasn't caught up yet. Delacroix was coming out of a building 30 feet away when Rodriguez walked past. The 19-year-old from Louisiana stopped, looked at the man who had been his idea of what a warrior was supposed to be, walking across the base with his shoulders back and his chin level and his career in pieces around him. Rodriguez didn't see him, or if he saw him, he didn't show it. Delacroix watched him until he turned a corner and was gone. Then he stood there for a moment in the way young people stand when the world has revised itself faster than their understanding of it can follow. A hand landed on his shoulder. Dominguez. "Come on, kid," Dominguez said. "Back to it." "Sergeant," Delacroix said, is it really, Yeah, Dominguez said. "It's real." "But he was." "I know what he was," Dominguez said. And the weight in that sentence, the years in it, the specific knowledge of a man who had served alongside someone long enough to know both the genuine greatness and the genuine failure, was something Delacroix felt even if he couldn't fully understand it yet. Being great at some things doesn't make you right about everything, and it doesn't protect other people from what you do when you're not being great. Delacroix absorbed that. It would take him longer to fully absorb, days probably, or weeks. Some things require time to settle into their actual shape. But the sentence itself he held on to. The way you hold on to a sentence that you know is load-bearing even before you understand what it's bearing. Back in the mess hall, quiet now. Nearly empty, the ordinary machinery of the lunch preparation beginning its cycle in the kitchen, Sarah Chen was still at the east wall table. She had been there with brief absences for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Her coffee had been replaced twice by a young private who had started doing it wordlessly around hour 2 without being asked, in the particular way that people extend small kindnesses to someone they recognize is doing difficult work. She was on the phone again. Her notebook was open. The page was full. "Yes," she said into the phone. "The operational phase is active. Rodriguez is suspended. Mercer is cooperating." A pause. "Peterson's documents are the priority now. If the legal team can get the subpoena executed by end of week." Another pause. "I know the timeline is tight. That's why I'm telling you it's the priority." A shorter pause. "Yes, I understand." She ended the call. She looked at the full page of her notebook. She turned to a fresh one. Outside, the base continued its life, the organized, purposeful, relentless life of a military installation that has its own gravity and its own momentum and does not pause for the private reckonings of any one person, no matter how large that person has loomed in the stories told about this place. Formations formed and dispersed. Equipment was maintained, orders were given and followed and confirmed. The work continued. But something had shifted in the architecture of the place, invisibly and audibly, in the way that the most significant shifts always happen. in the way that Torres sat at her desk that afternoon and felt for the first time in 2 years that the air in the room had a different quality, in the way that three other women on the base who had heard the compressed version of the morning's events through the military grapevine by early afternoon sat with that story and felt something move in them that they didn't have a clean word for. Not hope, exactly, not relief exactly, but the thing that precedes both of those, the thing that arrives when the world demonstrates unexpectedly and irrefutably that the rules apply to everyone. And in the JAG office where Rodriguez sat alone for 20 minutes before Foster returned, something was happening that had nothing to do with legal strategy or formal charges or the procedural machinery of military justice. Something quieter, something that didn't have a name in any regulation or any code of conduct. The particular terrible necessary work of a man looking at what he had done, not at what it had cost him, but at what it had cost the people it had been done to, and beginning slowly and without certainty about where it would lead the long process of understanding the difference. It was not redemption. It was too early for that word, and that word was not his to assign to himself. But it was a beginning, the kind that arrives not when you choose it, but when the alternative continuing to not begin finally costs more than you can pay. The formal charges were filed at 1400 hours, not just against Rodriguez. That was the part that moved through Camp Lejeune like a current through water. Silent and visible felt everywhere simultaneously. The document that Walsh's office transmitted to the Inspector General at precisely 2 in the afternoon named 4 individuals. Rodriguez was first. Colonel Peterson was second. 2 other senior enlisted personnel, both decorated, both with records that had been cited as exemplary in official communications as recently as 8 months ago, were third and fourth. 4 names, 1 document, 14 months of work made visible in a single transmission that took less than 30 seconds to send and would take years to fully resolve. Sarah was in Mercer's conference room when the confirmation came through. She looked at her phone, read the confirmation number, and wrote it in her notebook with the same unhurried precision she used for everything. The unnamed man sitting across from her nodded once. That was the entirety of the celebration, if it could be called that. The people who do this kind of work for a living have learned that the filing is not the finish line. It is the beginning of a different and longer race. Peterson's attorney contacted us at 13:30, the unnamed man said. He had a name. It was Calloway, and Sarah had known him for 6 years, and the professional shorthand between them was the shorthand of people who have worked in high-pressure rooms long enough that words become currency to be spent carefully. He's claiming procedural irregularities in the evidence collection. He'll claim that for 6 months and then stop, Sarah said. Probably, but it slows things. Everything slows things, Sarah said. That's what they're counting on. We counted on them counting on it. She closed her notebook. The witness statements from this morning, how many do we have confirmed? 14, Calloway said. Walsh's office processed 11 before noon. 3 more came in voluntarily this afternoon. Torres is scheduled for her formal recorded statement tomorrow at 900. And the others, the ones from the pattern, Simmons Hayes, the contractor. Calloway looked at her. Simmons was notified this morning at 1100. Her attorney contacted us at 12:15. She's willing to provide a full statement. Sarah absorbed this without visible reaction. But something moved in her eyes, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter and more complicated. The specific feeling of knowing that a person who was told for years that what happened to them didn't matter enough to act on has finally been told something different. Good, Sarah said, simply the word carrying more weight than its size. Hayes is still working through her attorney, and Calloway said. She's been burned before by the process closing around her. It's going to take time to rebuild the trust. We have time, Sarah said. We do this at her pace, not ours. And the contractor, her name is Linda Park. She left federal employment in 2023. She's in the private sector now. We reached out through her attorney this morning. Her response, Calloway paused. She cried, he said, on the phone with her attorney for about 4 minutes, and then she said yes. The room was quiet. Sarah looked at the table for a moment. It was a rare thing, a moment of stillness in a woman who was almost always in motion, always recording, always assessing. 4 seconds, maybe 5. The length of time it takes to let something real land before you put it away and continue working. Then she picked up her pen. Okay, she said, what's next? At 1423, Rodriguez was in his quarters. Not confined, the suspension didn't require physical confinement, and Foster had been clear that how he spent the next 72 hours outside of required appearances mattered. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, which was made with the precise mechanical tidiness of 15 years of military habit, and he was holding his phone with both hands but not looking at it. He had 17 missed calls, his mother twice, his sister, 4 colleagues, 3 people he hadn't spoken to in years, who had apparently heard enough of the story through the military network to reach out for reasons he couldn't fully parse: support, or curiosity, or the particular human compulsion to be close to something significant, even when the significance is someone else's disaster. He didn't call any of them back. He was thinking about Simmons. Her first name was Keisha. He had known that. Of course, you know the names of people in your unit. You know their records, their strengths, their weaknesses. But he had stopped using it at some point in some way that he hadn't noticed at the time. Had started thinking of her as Simmons, the designation, the problem, the person who had pushed back and needed to be managed. Had reduced her from a person with a first name and a life and a career she had worked for into a symbol of something that threatened the order of his world. He had not thought about this consciously. That was the thing that was sitting with him now in the quiet of his quarters, with 17 missed calls on his phone and a formal suspension in his personnel file. He had not thought about it consciously, which was not the same as it not happening. Things that are not thought about consciously are still chosen. The choice is just buried deeper in the place where what we tell ourselves meets what we actually do, and the gap between those two things is where the damage accumulates. His phone buzzed. Not a call, a message from Foster. 2 words: call me. He called her. 2 things, Foster said without preamble. First, Peterson's attorney has already begun suggesting that Rodriguez acted as an independent actor unprotected by and unknown to Peterson. They're going to try to build a wall between you and the systemic pattern. Meaning they'll use me as the ceiling, Rodriguez said. Make me the most senior person implicated and cut the investigation off before it reaches Peterson. Yes. Can they do that? They can try, Foster said. Which brings me to the second thing. Chen's team has formally extended you the option to cooperate as a material witness in the broader investigation. Full cooperation in exchange for consideration, not immunity consideration in the charging process. The charges against you don't disappear, but the weight of them changes. Rodriguez was quiet. Marcus, Foster said, Peterson covered for you 3 times. I want you to think carefully about what that means and what it might and who it cost. And then I want you to think about whether protecting him now, even passively, even just by staying silent, is a debt you actually owe. The silence on the line stretched long enough that Foster checked to make sure the call was still connected. Set it up, Rodriguez said. I'll meet with Chen. Foster exhaled. Tomorrow morning, 0900, I'll confirm with her office. Foster? He paused. Is Simmons, has she been contacted? Yes, Foster said carefully. She's cooperating. I can't share details about other witnesses. Right. A pause. I want her to know that what I did was wrong, not as a legal strategy. I just want her to know that I know. Foster was quiet for a moment. That's not something I can facilitate right now, she said. But it's something that matters. Write it down, what you just said to me, write it down in your own words. It'll matter later. He wrote it down. At 15:11, Dominguez knocked on Rodriguez's door. Rodriguez opened it and the 2 men looked at each other for a moment with the complicated visual language of people who have been through genuinely hard things together and are now standing on opposite sides of a divide that neither of them chose. I'm not here officially, Dominguez said. I know. I'm here because 17 years is 17 years. Rodriguez stepped back from the door. Dominguez came in and sat in a single chair. Rodriguez sat back on the edge of his bed. The room was the room of a man who lives with military precision and very little else clean-ordered spare. Talk to me, Dominguez said. About what? About what happened. The real version, not the statement. Rodriguez looked at him for a long time. Then he talked. Not the statement version, not the legal version, not the version shaped by Foster's careful architecture of what to say and when. The real version. The one that started not with the mess hall that morning, but years earlier with the first time someone failed to treat him the way he believed his record entitled him to be treated. And the thing that had hardened in him around that moment in the way that hardening had accumulated, layer by layer until it had become its own kind of armor. Armor that protected him from having to feel the gap between who he told himself he was and what he was actually doing to the people around him. Dominguez listened, didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. 17 years of knowing a man means knowing when to speak and when to let him find his own way to the truth, because the truth only counts when a person arrives at it themselves. When Rodriguez stopped, Dominguez was quiet for a long time. "You know what the hardest part is?" Dominguez said finally. "For me." "What?" "I saw it. Not all of it, not clearly. But I saw enough that I should have said something, and I told myself I didn't have enough to go on. And the truth is, I had plenty, and I just didn't want to be the one to say it." He looked at Rodriguez. "So I'm part of this too, not legally, but in the way that matters." Rodriguez looked at him. "You're not responsible for what I did." "No, but I'm responsible for what I didn't do." He stood up. "You're cooperating with Chen." "Tomorrow morning." Dominguez nodded. "Good, that's the right call." He moved toward the door, stopped. "When this is over, not the legal part, the other part, you're going to have to figure out who you are without the thing you used to use to know that. The rank, the reputation, the legend." He paused. "I don't know what that looks like, but I think you might be the kind of man who can find out. I'm not sure you would have been 6 months ago. I think this morning might have been the thing that made it possible." Rodriguez said nothing. Dominguez left. The door closed. Rodriguez sat in the spare ordered quiet of his room and held the weight of what Dominguez had just said, not as comfort, not as absolution, but as something harder and more useful. The observation of a man who knows you well enough to see the thing underneath the thing and cares enough to say it even when saying it costs something. He sat with it for a long time. Outside at 1534, Torres was finishing her written account at her desk, the one Sarah had asked for in her own words exactly as she remembered it. She had been writing for 2 hours. It was 7 pages long. She read it back to herself, once made 2 small corrections, and then sat looking at it with the expression of someone who has just made something that cannot be unmade. Her phone showed 3 messages from colleagues who had heard the fragmented version of the morning story and wanted the real one. She hadn't answered any of them. Not because she was afraid, but because the real version wasn't hers to distribute. It belonged to the process now, to the statements and the files and the careful, unglamorous machinery of accountability. She saved the document, printed a copy, put it in the envelope Sarah had given her that morning with the address of the DIA field office pre-printed on the front. She sealed it. It was, she thought, the smallest possible action. 7 pages in an envelope. But small actions, she was learning, were sometimes the architecture of things that seemed enormous in retrospect. The morning had started with one woman sitting alone at a table writing in a notebook. That was a small action, and it had moved through the day like a stone dropped in water, its rings expanding outward until they reached edges that nobody in the mess hall at 0742 had known existed. She mailed the envelope at 1545. At 1600, Sarah was in her temporary office, a room that Mercer had assigned her the previous morning, clean and functional, equipped with nothing she hadn't brought herself. She was on a video call with 3 people in a windowless room at a building in Arlington that she had spent more time in over the past 14 months than she had in her own apartment. "The Peterson angle is the priority now," then she said. "Rodriguez is cooperating. His statement is going to fill in the operational details of how the complaint suppression actually worked, who was contacted, what was communicated, what was exchanged in return for the closures." "What's his motivation for full cooperation?" one of the 3 asked. "Several things," Sarah said. "Foster is good, and she gave him accurate advice. He's also," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "he's processing something. Genuinely. I've seen people cooperate from pure self-interest, and it looks different from what I saw in his file update this afternoon." "Does his motivation change the value of his testimony?" "No," Sarah said, "but it changes what we can build from it. A witness who understands the damage is a different kind of witness than one who's just managing consequences." The call continued for 22 minutes, covering logistics and timelines and the specific legal strategies that Peterson's team was already assembling. Sarah answered every question with the same focused, compact precision she brought to everything. When the call ended, she sat for a moment in the silence of the room, which was the particular silence of late afternoon on a day that has been very long and very dense with consequence. She thought about Linda Park crying on the phone for 4 minutes. She thought about Keisha Simmons, whose attorney had called within an hour. She thought about Hayes still working through her trust in a process that had failed her before. She thought about Torres, 23 years old, with her shaking hands and her steady voice. She thought about Delacroix, not because she knew him specifically, but because she had seen the face of the young man watching from 2 tables away when Rodriguez hit the floor, and she had recognized the expression. The collapse of a particular understanding of the world. The moment when a story you've been using to make sense of things reveals that it was missing chapters. Those moments were brutal. She knew that. She had her own version of that moment years earlier in a different institution with a different person who had used their size and their reputation and the assumption of their own authority to take up space that didn't belong to them. She had reported it. The report had gone nowhere. And the specific, hollow helplessness of that outcome, the sound of a system choosing its own comfort over someone's truth, was the reason she had spent 14 months building something that could not be quietly closed. She had not become Sarah Chendivar, a special investigator to avenge a personal grievance. She had become that person because the system needs people who understand what it feels like when the system fails and who are angry enough about it to do the painstaking, undramatic, unglamorous work of building the kind of case that can't be closed without consequences. That was the work, not the 4 seconds in the mess hall. Those 4 seconds were 3 years of training applied to a specific immediate threat. The work was the 14 months, the files, the witnesses, the careful, patient assembly of a picture that told the truth too completely to be set aside. She opened her notebook, wrote the date and time at the top of a fresh page, began her end-of-day documentation. At 17:12, Rodriguez requested a meeting with Walsh. She came to him, not to his quarters, to a neutral conference room, and sat across from him with the same professional composure she had maintained throughout the day. He sat with his hands flat on the table, the gesture that had become over the course of the day his signature position, the posture of a man holding something still that wants to move. "I want to say something for the record," Rodriguez said. Walsh opened her notebook. "Go ahead. What happened this morning in the physical confrontation, that was on me. Entirely. She warned me 3 times clearly. What I did after those warnings was my choice, and it had nothing to do with training or instinct or self-defense. It was ego. I need that on record because I don't want there to be any version of this where I implied otherwise." Walsh wrote it down. "And the pattern," Rodriguez continued, "the complaints, Simmons, Hayes, the others, I used the system to make those go away because the system let me, and I told myself that was the system working the way it was supposed to. It wasn't. The system was broken, and I knew it was broken because I was part of the breaking of it." He paused. "I need that on record too." Walsh looked at him. In 18 years of this work, she had heard a lot of statements. Most of them were careful, managed, architecturally sound structures designed to do the minimum required and protect the maximum possible. What she was hearing right now was different. It was the difference between a statement and an accounting, between what a person says because they have to and what they say because not saying it has finally become impossible. "Is there anything else?" she said. "Yeah," Rodriguez said. "I want to apologize to you, personally, for what this morning looked like on your watch. You ran a clean process all day. You didn't deserve to start it the way you did." Walsh was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Noted, thank you." She meant it. The meeting lasted 11 more minutes, covering procedural details, the timeline for tomorrow's session with Sarah, the practical logistics of his suspension. When it was over, Rodriguez walked back through the base in the early evening light, the light that comes when a day has been so full that the sky seems surprised it has finally gotten dark. He passed the mess hall. He stopped. He stood outside the building for a long moment. Inside, through the noise and the movement of the dinner service, 800 people were doing what the military requires, eating, fueling, continuing. None of them knew he was standing outside. None of them were watching. For the first time all day, he was not being observed. And the man he was when no one was watching, the man he had always been in those moments, in the honest, unperformed privacy of his own assessment of himself, was standing in the thin, specific gap between the person he had been that morning when he walked into that building and the person that the day had made necessary. The gap was not comfortable. It was not supposed to be. The gap was where the work happened, not the physical work, not the combat work, but the harder and longer work of a man who has been told a story about himself for so long that he forgot it was a story and is now slowly learning to write a different one. He didn't go inside. He turned and walked back toward his quarters. At 0900 the next morning, he sat down across from Sarah Chen. She had her notebook open. Her pen was ready. Her coffee this time was hot. She looked at him across the table, not with triumph, not with judgment, not with any of the emotions that the previous 24 hours might have earned, but with the focus, steady professional attention of a person who has a job to do and intends to do it thoroughly. "Let's start at the beginning," she said. He looked at her, at the woman who had sat in the mess hall and not looked up, who had warned him 3 times, who had put him on the floor in 4 seconds in front of 1,000 people, not because she needed to prove something, but because he had given her no other option, who had spent 14 months building something careful and true and permanent out of the stories that the system had tried to make disappear. "Okay," he said, and he talked. He talked for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He did not hedge. He did not manage. He did not produce the careful, architecturally sound statement shaped by self-protection. He told the truth, the full, detailed, specific truth, with names and dates and conversations and the precise mechanics of how a system gets bent by the people inside it who have decided their record is worth more than someone else's dignity. Sarah wrote it all down, every word, every name, every date. When he was done, the room was quiet. "One more thing," Rodriguez said. Sarah looked up. "Keisha Simmons," he said. "When this is over, when the process allows it, I want to tell her directly that what I did was wrong. Not through attorneys, not through formal channels, person to person." He paused. "Can you tell her that?" "Not now, when the time is right, that I want the chance to say it directly." Sarah looked at him for a moment. "I'll tell her," she said. She closed her notebook. Outside, the base continued its relentless, purposeful life. Formations and duties in the steady accumulated work of an institution that is larger than any one person's failure or any one person's reckoning. The sun was up and the day was moving, and somewhere across the base, Torres was sitting at her desk with the particular feeling of a person who has done a difficult right thing and is learning slowly what that feels like in the body, not comfortable, not triumphant, but solid, real. The feeling of weight that is yours placed where it belongs. And Delacroix at his morning formation was listening differently, not just to the commands to the weight behind them, to the difference between authority that is earned and authority that is assumed, to the space between the legend and the man. He was 19 years old and the world had just revised itself in a way that would take years to fully absorb. And he was standing in the early morning light, trying on the new shape of it, finding it uncomfortable and necessary, and in a way he couldn't yet articulate, more true than the version he had arrived with. That morning in the mess hall had lasted less than 4 minutes from the moment Rodriguez walked in to the moment he hit the floor. But what those 4 minutes had set in motion, the statements, the files, the 14 months of patient invisible work made suddenly irrevocably visible, would take years to fully resolve and leave a mark on the institution that no official communication would fully capture. Some truths are like that. They wait in the quiet, written in small notebooks by unhurried hands until the moment arrives when they cannot be contained any longer. And then they move through everything and nothing that was built on the assumption that they didn't exist can stand unchanged on the other side. Sarah Chen had known that from the beginning. That was why she had been ready. That was why when the biggest man in the room reached for her arm, she had already known exactly what she was going to do, not because she had wanted the confrontation, but because she had understood with the clear and patient certainty of someone who has done the work that the truth does not wait for permission. It arrives when it's ready, and it is never in the end stopped by the size of the person standing in its way.